She set her wine glass down like a period at the end of a sentence she'd been writing for months. I want a divorce, Kenneth. I've met someone. His name is Ronald. He's an investor. He has an office right in the building where you work. A pause. The kind that wasn't waiting for a response. He's a step forward for me. Kenneth didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't ask her to repeat it. He just looked at her. And 6 floors above that kitchen, in a corner office of the building she just mentioned, Ronald Pierce was on a recorded investor call telling 3 other men exactly what he thought of the husband. The building manager doesn't ask questions. He shows up. He does his job. He doesn't notice what's happening right up under his nose. Guys like that just mop floors and say thank you. What nobody in that room knew, what Stephanie didn't know standing in that kitchen. What Ronald Pierce was about to find out in the worst possible way, the man they were laughing at owned every floor of that building. He had. For 15 years. You only get 1, maybe 2 jobs in this life. Now, what you own. And know what it costs you to pretend you don't. Kenneth Webb had been doing both since the age of 31, the year his father died in the middle of a Tuesday, and left him holding the keys to something nobody in the room could see. Not the family, not the attorneys who filed the paperwork, not the neighbors who came to the repast and ate Donna's sweet potato pie and said George was a good man, a real good man. The way people say things at funerals that are true but incomplete, none of them knew, just Kenneth. And Kenneth had decided, somewhere in the weeks after the burial, that this was the correct number of people who needed to know. Chicago in October doesn't ease you into anything. It just arrives. Cold off the lake, low fog sitting on the river, the kind of morning that makes people walk faster and talk less and stop pretending summer was ever really theirs to begin with. Kenneth pulled his 2010 Ford F-150 out of the brownstone garage at I-441 a.m. the way he did every weekday, with the unhurried precision of a man whose routine had long since stopped requiring thought. Same route north, same turn into the loop, same parking spot on the lower level of the loading dock at 220 South Wacker Drive, where his truck sat alongside delivery vehicles and utility vans and was therefore invisible to anyone arriving through the lobby. He had 149,000 miles on the truck. The driver's seat had a groove in it that fit him exactly, worn in over years of the same body making the same trip. He did not plan to replace the truck. Truck worked. He walked through the service entrance before the lobby chandeliers had been switched on, just the low amber emergency lighting turning the marble floor into something that looked like the inside of an idea that hadn't announced itself yet. The ventilation system hummed. The building breathed. He moved through it without slowing, past the receiving area and the freight elevator bank and the secondary maintenance corridor that connected to the stairwell. And he knew this route the way he knew the layout of his mother's house, not by memory but by something older than memory, by the accumulated physics of a body that had made the same passage thousands of times. Kenneth knew this building the way certain people know rivers. Not by studying them, by having moved through them long enough that the current became familiar. He knew which elevator ran slow on cold mornings, specifically the north bank on the passenger side, which had a pressure differential issue in the cable housing that the service company had looked at twice and not fully resolved. He knew which stretch of the 7th floor corridor held moisture after hard rain because the window seal on the east wall had a hairline compromise that was too small to trigger an emergency work order and too consistent to ignore. He knew which tenant on the 23rd floor filed noise complaints that she never actually sent to the management office because she always called down to Kenneth directly, because Kenneth was the one who fixed things and she had figured that out in her first month in the building and acted accordingly ever since. That was the reputation: steady, reliable, the good one. Invisible in exactly the way that people who do necessary work become invisible to the people who benefit most from it. He did not mind this. That was the piece nobody ever thought to understand. The invisibility was not a wound he carried. It was a choice. His grandfather's voice lived inside it somewhere, an old instruction that had taken root so early in Kenneth's understanding of himself that it no longer felt like advice. It felt like bedrock. Own something quiet, son. Let the world make noise about somebody else. Calvin Webb Sr. had said this on a porch in Hyde Park when Kenneth was 11 years old, watching his grandfather finish a peach over the kitchen sink. and the old man had not looked up when he said it, because he didn't need to. He knew his grandson was listening. He had always known when his grandson was listening. That was one of the things about Calvin Sr. that Kenneth had spent his adult life trying to understand and his adult life trying to become. Calvin Sr. had purchased 220 South Wacker Drive in 1988. The Loop's commercial market was in a period of repositioning, and most of the money was moving east toward the Gold Coast or circling the River North Corridor, and the people who called themselves smart were avoiding the mid-range Wacker inventory, like a rumor they didn't want to be associated with. Calvin Sr. did not follow smart money. He followed his read of the city, and his read was simple. Chicago didn't shrink, it reorganized. Patient men won. He was right. He was always right in the way that certain men are right about certain things, quietly and ahead of schedule, and without requiring anyone to acknowledge it. By the time Kenneth's father, Pastor George Webb, had added 2 more commercial properties to the trust portfolio in 1999 and again in 2004, the family held something that didn't have a name in their neighborhood, because nothing that looked like them was supposed to have it. Generational commercial equity, the unglamorous kind. No penthouses, no magazine feature, no invitation to speak at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in the suburb that had been built for people who looked like someone else. Just deed after deed, filed correctly, managed carefully, passed from one generation to the next like the good silverware, the kind you actually used. When George died, Kenneth was 31. He signed the trustee papers on a Wednesday and was back in the building in his maintenance uniform on Thursday because the third-floor boiler room needed a pressure check and nobody else was going to do it correctly. That was 15 years ago. He had not told anyone since. Not colleagues, not neighbors, not the woman he married 2 years later in a ceremony at a church in Bronzeville on a Saturday in June when the weather was exactly right and everything felt like it was beginning. He had not told Stephanie. He had been waiting for her to ask. The question had never come. The morning Brian found him at the 9th floor service panel was the 2nd Tuesday of October, same month, heavier fog than last year, the kind that made the Chicago River look like it was deciding something. Brian Batts was 38 years old and had been on Kenneth's crew for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had logged approximately 6 years' worth of unrequested conversation, operated at a consistent batting average of 0 on reading a room, and demonstrated a near-clinical inability to recognize when a topic had been closed. But Brian was skilled with his hands honest in the way that certain people are honest, without strategy or performance, just because they decided to be, and Kenneth had come to understand that these qualities together were rarer than they appeared, and worth more than their inconvenience cost. Webb. Brian said this the way he always opened sentences he was slightly afraid to finish. 2 syllables, slight upward inflection on the second. A verbal prelude that functioned less as warning, and more as the sound of a man who already knew he was going somewhere difficult. Kenneth kept working. What? I'm just saying something I heard. You hear things constantly, Brian. This one's different. His voice dropped, which was either genuine discretion or theater. With Brian, the line between those things was narrow. Angela at the front desk said she saw Mrs. Webb going up to 15 last week. Twice. After 6, the panel showed everything functioning within normal parameters. Kenneth wrote that down on the inspection clipboard. Angela tracks the whole building, he said. Angela has memorized the building. That's different from tracking it. Brian shifted his weight. I'm telling you what I heard. I know what you're telling me. You don't seem, Brian. Yeah, thermostat check on 11. The east register has been running 2 degrees warm. Brian heard the redirect. He heard it the way he always heard redirects, loudly, with the full theatrical acknowledgement of a man who wanted no credit for cooperating. He picked up his toolbox, repositioned it under his arm with more deliberateness than was required, and moved down the hall. He did not say anything else for the rest of the hour. That was how Kenneth knew Brian was actually concerned. Not the question, the silence after he'd been told to drop it. Here is what Brian did not know. What Angelo at the front desk did not know. What the tenants on 12 and 15 and 23 did not know. What the building's property management software did not know, because the software showed Kenneth Webb as head of facilities, a title attached to a salary and a parking pass, and a benefits package that nobody had ever looked at closely enough to question. Coleman Properties LLC, the entity listed on every lease agreement in the building, was not a third-party management company. It was a subsidiary of the Webb Family Trust, and the Webb Family Trust was administered by Kenneth James Webb, age 46, who arrived through the service entrance at 5:41 every weekday morning in a Navy maintenance uniform, and who had done so for the better part of 2 decades, because his grandfather had told him once that a man who doesn't understand how the pipes work in his own building doesn't deserve to have his name on the deed. The Rolex Datchurst on his left wrist was the only thing that didn't fit the uniform. Rose gold case, champagne dial. His father's watch, cleaned and reset after the funeral, worn every single day since, not as a statement, as a reminder of what the work was actually for. Nobody ever asked about the watch. They assumed he had inherited it from someone less significant than he had. Stephanie Webb occupied 3 corner offices on the 12th floor under the signage, Stephanie Webb PR, white letters on frosted glass, the kind of branding communicated exactly who she was and expected the room to adjust accordingly. She had built the firm from a rented spare bedroom in Bronzeville 8 years ago, and she had done it with intelligence and a hunger for a kind of success that didn't diminish just because some of it had already arrived. Kenneth had always admired this. He had just stopped being part of the story. She was telling herself about it. He realized this at a client cocktail party 3 months before October, in a hotel ballroom in River North, with circular tables and ambient jazz and crystal glasses and all the other objects that existed specifically to signal that the people holding them had arrived somewhere. He had come straight from the building, hadn't had time to change. Navy coveralls, work belt. He walked in looking like the man who'd been called about the HVAC. He spotted Stephanie near the bar before she saw him. She was laughing, the full, deliberate version she kept for rooms she needed to own. And beside her, close but not touching, was a man in a charcoal suit that carried the specific weight of money spent appearance as investment. False tall, well-built, the kind of easy smile that had been recalibrated over years for exactly this kind of room. Kenneth didn't know his name yet. That came later. That night the man was just a fact, a proximity. A detail Kenneth filed the way he filed all details, without urgency, without drama, in the place where things waited until they were needed. Stephanie turned and saw him walking toward her. Something crossed her face. Too fast to name, but too specific to miss. Not guilt, not yet. Something more like a rapid internal calculation being completed under time pressure. She kept her voice low and her expression professional, her words intended only for him. "Why didn't you go home and change first? You said 7. There wasn't time. It's fine." And the smile expanded back into the public version, and she turned slightly back toward the man in the charcoal suit and made an introduction that lasted less than 30 seconds and communicated, in the specific mathematics of the way she positioned Vodeby between the two men, everything Kenneth needed to understand about how she had already organized this situation in her own mind. He took a glass of water from a passing tray. He stood at the edge of the room for 40 minutes. He left. Stephanie did not notice him go. He was certain of this, not because he was testing her, but because he knew her well enough to know that when she was operating in a room at full capacity, she processed everything in terms of what it needed from her, and he had apparently stopped needing anything from her that she hadn't already allocated. He drove home. He sat in the small office behind the kitchen, the one with the filing cabinet and the locked desk drawer, and he thought about the particular way a building shows its problems, not in a single collapse, in small divergences from the expected range, a door that begins to stick, a pressure reading that is technically within tolerance but trending toward the boundary, a seal that is too small to require an emergency order but too consistent to dismiss. You didn't wait for the pipe to burst. You paid attention to the trend. He called Pamela Scott on a Thursday evening in May, 5 months before the October Tuesday when Stephanie would stand at the kitchen counter and say the words. Pamela Scott had been the Webb Family Trust's legal counsel for 11 years. She was 50 years old, precise in thought and presentation, the kind of attorney who read documents the way a surgeon read diagnostic imaging, with full knowledge that the thing she was looking for was probably there whether she wanted to find it or not. She and Kenneth had overlapped at the University of Illinois, in the same economics cohort, 2 People who had each been the only one of something in smart most of the classes and had never once discussed because it didn't require discussion. She picked up on the second ring. I need the security footage retention logs, Kenneth said. Floors 12 and 15. Last 3 months, silence. Then, Kenneth, and I need you to start drafting divorce papers. Don't file them, just have them prepared. Longer silence. The kind where someone is not deciding what to think, but deciding how much of what they're thinking to say. Are you certain? Not entirely. That's why I'm not filing yet. All right, the sound of keys somewhere in her office. Is there a name? Ronald Pierce. Pierce Investment Group. Whatever you can find. A pause that wasn't about typing. That name isn't unfamiliar to me. Let me verify something before I say more. She didn't explain what. Kenneth didn't ask. He put the phone down and looked at the monitor feed on the screen in the corner of his office. 40 floors cycling through in slow rotation. His building watching itself the way it had been watching itself since most of the people in it were old enough to sign a lease. He reached in the locked drawer. He pulled out and he wrote a name on the tab in his own handwriting. Ronald Pierce. He filed it. He went to bed and slept without particular difficulty, because a man who has decided to pay attention rather than react sleeps better than a man who has decided to feel everything at once. The morning after Stephanie told him she wanted a divorce, Kenneth woke at 5:41. He did not lie in the dark processing it. Did not sit on the edge of the mattress doing the things that grief was supposed to require in the first hours. He got up. He made coffee. He made the turkey sandwich his mother had taught him to make when he was 9, sharp cheddar and a thin spread of mustard and exactly 4 slices of deli turkey, not 3 and not 5, eaten standing at the kitchen counter the way he always ate it. He thought about the pressure check on 14 he'd been meaning to get to. The flickering sensor light in the stairwell on 20. The thermostat reading Brian had reported on 11, which was probably a recalibration issue rather than a full unit replacement. He thought about the way she'd said it, not with anger, not with cruelty, exactly. With the practical efficiency of a person delivering a decision they'd made privately and had only now gotten around to presenting. She had poured herself wine and not offered him any. She had stood at the kitchen counter he'd built during a long weekend 5 years earlier, the one she'd complained about for 2 months before admitting. It was exactly right, and she had said the words the way someone reads from a prepared agenda. Kenneth, I want a divorce. I've met someone. His name is Ronald. He's an investor. He has an office right in the building where you work. He's a step forward for me, a step forward. She had used that phrase. He had asked what floor, 15, she'd said. And then, with a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty, why does that matter? He had said it didn't. He had said, okay, if that's what you want. He had rinsed his coffee cup and dried his hands on the dish towel and walked to the back bedroom and closed the door. He had heard her standing in the kitchen for several minutes after, the particular silence of a person who has delivered a prepared statement and received a response they hadn't prepared for. She had expected something louder. He had not provided it. What Stephanie understood in that silence was that her husband had not fought for her. What she hadn't understood was why. She had read his stillness as acceptance, as the quiet of a man who had nothing left to say because there was nothing worth saying. She had entirely misread the quiet. His grandfather's voice again, the same porch, a different afternoon. Quiet isn't empty, son. Quiet is where you keep the things that aren't ready to be loud yet. He was on the 12th floor at 8:15 the next morning, running the east hallway register inspection, when he heard her. She was near the windows at the far end of the corridor, phone pressed to her ear, back half-turned. Her voice was low and warm. The red register she used when she wasn't performing anything, when she was just being herself with someone she was comfortable with. A register Kenneth had not heard directed at him in longer than he was going to think about right now. Stop it. A real laugh. Not the professional one, the one from before. You are terrible. Tonight. She hung up, turned. Saw Kenneth kneeling by the supply panel with his toolkit open. Something moved across her face and then was gone, replaced by the smooth professional expression that she maintained in the building the way other people maintain their email signatures. Oh good. You're here, business voice. Efficient. The East conference room is running warm again. Mr. Pierce has partners coming this afternoon. Can you look at it? She called him. Mr. Pierce, not Ronald. Like the name was a title she was rehearsing for a role she'd already accepted. Kenneth looked up at her. "I'll take care of it." She nodded and turned and walked back down the corridor with the purposeful stride of someone who has a full and has already allocated time to each part of it. She did not look back. He watched her go and did not let himself feel the full weight of what that walk meant. Not here, not now. He put the full weight in the same place he put everything that wasn't ready to be loud yet. He fixed the thermostat. It needed a recalibration, not a replacement. He did the rest of his rounds and clocked out at 4:30 and drove south. Sharon from next door was at her window boxes when Kenneth pulled up to his mother's house in Hyde Park, 68 years old. Wearing deep violet from collar to ankle, the lavender gardening gloves the only variation, because Sharon had decided at some point in her 50s that purple was colored with dignity, and had applied this principle with the consistency of someone who had stopped asking permission for their convictions. "Kenneth," she lifted one gloved hand without looking up from the soil. "You look like your daddy when he was coming home after a week that had too many days in it." "I'm fine, Mrs. Sharon." "Everybody says fine." She pinched a dead leaf off the nearest plant with surgical precision. "Right up until they're not fine, and then there's nobody around to help because they spent all their time saying fine." She pointed toward the front door with her trowel. "Go inside. Your mama made roasted chicken. She already promised me a plate." Donna Webb was on the porch with the swing that had been creaking on its chains since before Kenneth was born, shelling field peas into a ceramic bowl, not looking up. "You're early," she said. "Something's wrong, not a question." Donna Webb had not wasted a question on something she already knew the answer to in decades. Kenneth sat on the top step beside her. "Stephanie wants a divorce, even. Just the facts. She's involved with someone. Ronald Pierce. He has an office on the 15th floor." Donna's hands went still over the bowl. One beat, two. She set the bowl on the side table and stood and walked into the house without a word. He followed her through the front room, past the photographs on the wall that ran the family's history from Calvin Sr. in his army uniform and straight through to Kenneth at his college graduation, looking young and slightly stunned that the work had paid off, into the small back room she still called her office, though it hadn't functioned as one in decades. Filing cabinet, pull-chain lamp, the heavy iron safe, painted dark green, that had belonged to Calvin Sr. and had never moved from its corner in the 53 years since he'd placed it there because it weighed more than argument. Donna knelt in front of it and turned the dial with the unhurried familiarity of muscle memory. She removed a thick folder tied with cotton ribbon. She set it on the small desk and stood back. "In July," she said, not looking at him yet, "Stephanie called me. Said she needed to borrow money. Personal matter. I didn't press her." A pause. "But she let something slip. She needed it settled before Ronald found out how tight her finances were." Kenneth was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me? Because you were raised to gather truth before you swing at anything." Now she looked at him. Eyes level, jaw set. "I was doing exactly that." He sat in the wooden chair by the desk, the one that had been in this room since his father was a child, and put his hands flat on his knees. There was a grief in the room without a clear object. Not grief for the marriage. Not grief for Stephanie or for himself specifically. Something older than that. The grief of learning that a person can be present in your life for 11 years and still never look in the direction where the real thing is standing. "She's been paying rent to the building," he said. "I know. She doesn't know that. I know that too." Donna sat on the edge of the desk, the way she'd always sat when the conversations were the real ones. "I called Stephanie in September. I told her, 'Kenneth is not the man you think he is. Be careful with what you're throwing away.' What did she say?" "She said I didn't understand what she and Ronald had." The porch swing outside creaked in the wind. Sharon's too from next door, where she had apparently taken her chicken and her opinions to the outdoor chair and was conducting whatever private assessment she was running on the state of the neighborhood. She didn't ignore what I said because she doubted it, Donna said. Her voice did not do judgment on this, just the weight of a fact observed carefully. She ignored it because believing it would have meant admitting she'd already made the mistake. And the thing she was most afraid of was never poverty. It was being overlooked. Being the woman who stayed with a man the world passed over, and being passed over right alongside him. Kenneth looked at the folder, the deed, the trust documents, 3 generations of men and their belief that ownership was not a trophy but a form of care. She never asked, he said, not an accusation, more like the final tab of a long account being closed. 11 years, not about the building, about me. What I was actually doing in there, what any of it meant. No, Donna said. She didn't. He sat with that for a moment. Sharon knocked on the back door frame from the hallway, with the confidence of someone who had never in 45 years been turned away from this kitchen and did not intend to begin now. She came in holding a covered dish. Donna, I made sweet potato pie. I'm leaving you half. She set it on the counter and registered Kenneth, and her expression shifted into something warm and diagnostic simultaneously. Wednesday. You only come on Wednesdays when something is working itself out. I'm working on it, Kenneth said. She cut herself a piece of pie with the silverware she'd brought from her own house, but because Sharon planned ahead. She settled into the other chair without being invited, plate on her lap, and looked at Kenneth the way people look at someone they've known since he was small enough to be lifted. Your grandfather had a face he made when he was handling something large. You have it right now. She pointed her fork. Handle it, then eat. In that order, he stayed for an hour. He ate pie on the drive back to the building. He stopped at a light on 55th Street and thought about something Pamela had told him in June, the week after she'd started looking into Ronald Pierce. Kenneth, she'd said, he's not just deceiving Stephanie. He's been using the address of your building to tell investors he has an inside relationship with the ownership structure. He's been positioning your property as his access, while calling you someone who doesn't notice what's happening around him. Kenneth answered that he had not responded for a moment. Then he'd said, when can you have the full picture on his investor relationships? And Pamela had said, give me a few more weeks. And he had said, take what we need, because patience was not something Kenneth had learned. It was something he had inherited, like the deed and the trust documents and the rose gold watch on his left wrist, passed down through a line of men who understood that the right moment and the fast moment were almost never the same moment, and that the discipline to wait for one and not accept the other was the entire difference between building something and just reacting to everything. The light changed. He drove north. He had been paying attention for 5 months. He was almost done. Pamela's office was on the 22nd floor of the building, directly east of 220 South Wacker. Close enough that on a clear morning you could see the upper floors of Kenneth's building from her conference room window, all that glass and steel catching the lake light in a way that made it look like something that had always been there and always would be. Which, in the relevant sense, it had and would. He had been to her office 11 times in 11 years. He knew this because Pamela kept a sign-in log for every in-person meeting, not for security purposes but for her own record, because she did not trust memory for things that mattered, and she had told him this once, directly, without apology, and he had respected it immediately. The office reflected the same principle. Clean in the way that communicated a mind organized along similar lines. Nothing decorative on the desk surface. A single framed photograph on the credenza behind her chair, angled slightly inward, which Kenneth had never looked at directly because it was not his business. Navy vest over a white dress shirt, glasses with thin gold frames that she removed when she was doing something she needed to think about rather than just process. She had the folder open when he walked in on Monday morning, the complete picture on Ronald Pierce. She said, without preamble, because Pamela did not use preamble with Kenneth. They had known each other too long for the scaffolding. Third fund. The first 2 failed. First one collapsed under over-leveraging, compounded by a series of poor position calls he made in a 12-month window. The second had what I would describe as a transparency deficit with its investor base. She looked at him over the glasses. There was litigation from a former partner in Naperville. Settled privately in August. Confidentiality clause in the agreement, but the existence of the suit is public record, and the amounts involved, which I've been able to estimate through indirect means, are not smalls. Kenneth was in the chair across from her. He did not take notes. He didn't need to. The settlement came out of personal assets, Pamela continued, which partially explains the financial pressure Stephanie mentioned to your mother in July. Ronald Pierce is not a man standing on solid ground. He is a man who has become extremely skilled at performing the appearance of solid ground for the benefit of people who haven't looked closely enough. The investor base on the current fund, primarily one anchor entity. Capital Horizon Group, based in Atlanta. Sophisticated institutional money, which is relevant because it means they conduct their own due diligence and they would not appreciate learning that the fund they've backed has been marketing access to assets the fund manager doesn't actually control. She paused. And here is where it gets specific to you. The diversified external portfolio, the one you turned over to the outside asset management group 6 years ago, has a small passive limited partner position in Pierce Investment Group. It's been sitting there for 2 years. Below your standard reporting threshold, which is why you haven't seen it in the quarterly summaries. Kenneth was still, which means, Pamela said, measuring each word, that we are legally entitled to every investor communication and every archived recording from Pierce Investment Group's quarterly update calls as limited partners. Standard regulatory entitlement. They can't refuse the request, and they can't claim privilege over materials that were already distributed to the investor class. How many calls? 6 over 2 years. I submitted the archive request to their compliance department Friday afternoon. I'll have the files by end of week. And Capital Horizon, they have an indirect position in one of the collaborative holdings in the Webb external portfolio. Through a holding entity that was established when the outside managers restructured the diversified sleeve in 2021, she set her pen down. We are not adversaries to Capital Horizon. We are fellow investors with shared exposure to the same underlying vehicle. If we were to ensure they had complete and accurate information about how that vehicle has been marketed, specifically whether the marketing has involved representations about access to assets that the fund does not in fact control, they would make their own decision about their continued participation. Without any instruction from us, when can you have that conversation ready? By Wednesday. I'll frame it as investor-to-investor disclosure, which is exactly what it is. She looked at him. Kenneth, what do you want the Thursday meeting to accomplish? He thought about this. Not because he didn't know, because he wanted to say it precisely. I want Ronald Pierce to sit in a room in this building and understand exactly what he has been moving through, he said, full set. Not as a legal proceeding, not as a negotiation, just as a fact delivered clearly by the person whose name is on the deed. Pamela nodded. Once, the nod of a person who has already run the scenario and assessed it and found it sound. Floor 15, she said. Corner conference room. Yes, that's the same floor where the archived footage shows. I know which floor it is. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. I'll have the formal invitation sent through Coleman Properties letterhead today. He'll receive it as a property management communication. Standard tenant matter. Nothing in the language will indicate otherwise. He stood. Picked up his jacket. Pamela, he stopped at the door. There's one more item. The bank statements from the medical expenses 3 years ago. Stephanie's mother. 30,000 over 14 months. I know the account. I reviewed it when you mentioned the possible divorce filing in May. In the asset division conversation, I don't want those payments used as a claim. I want them excluded from the marital asset calculation entirely. Pamela looked at him. The specific look she had when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was actually thinking. That expenditure legitimately factors into. I know what it factors into. I want it excluded. Pause. All right. I didn't make those payments to hold them, Kenneth said. I made them because her mother was sick and she needed the care. That's the whole of it. Pamela wrote something down. I'll structure it accordingly. He walked out and took the elevator down and went back to work because the building did not pause for the things that were happening inside it, and neither did he. Tuesday. The building had found its weekly rhythm by Tuesday, the adjustment of Monday behind it, the systems running at their established pace. Kenneth was on the 9th floor, replacing a faulty sensor in the iced stoop when Brian appeared at the top of the stairs with his toolbox and the specific posture of a man who has been holding something since yesterday and has reached his storage limit. I need to say something, Brian announced. You always need to say something. This one's actually useful. Kenneth kept working. The sensor housing required a specific torque and he applied it with the attention the task required. Then say it. I was in the canteen with Angela at lunch yesterday. Brian set his toolbox down with the deliberateness of someone setting the scene. I asked her a question about the lease paperwork for floor 15. The sensor read correctly. Kenneth made a note. Brian. She confirmed the lease for Pierce Investment Group is filed under Coleman Properties. Represented by Pamela Scott J.D., acting as trustee counsel. He paused, and I realized something. Coleman Properties and the Webb Family Trust are the same entity. Kenneth looked up at him. Brian met the look. Steadier than usual. Without the ambient energy he normally brought to conversations and he wasn't sure he should be having. I've been on this crew 6 years, Brian said. I know what Coleman Properties is. I know whose name routes through the employment documents. I just never connected it to floor 15 until Angela said Pamela Scott's name. He didn't look away. I'm not telling you this because I think you owe me anything. I'm telling you because if there's something happening Thursday that I might accidentally interfere with, I need to know what not to do. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. You haven't interfered with anything, he said. You've done your job. That's what I need from you, Brian exhaled. The exhale of a man releasing a weight he'd been unaware he was holding. Understood. He picked up his toolbox, then put it back down. On Webb. For what it's worth, the usual frequency in his voice was absent. Just plain statement. I've been watching you run this building for 6 years. I didn't know about the deed, but I knew something didn't fit the category. The way contractors talked to you. The way you knew about building decisions before the announcements went out. The way people looked at you when something actually went wrong, like they were looking at the person who actually knew. He nodded once. It made sense when I put it together. Angela doesn't know, Kenneth said. No. She knows Coleman Properties manages the building. She doesn't know what's behind it. Keep it that way until Friday. Brian picked up the toolbox for real this time. And after Friday it won't matter. Brian walked to the end of the corridor and did not say another word for the rest of the shift, which was, by a significant margin, the longest Brian Batts had ever gone without speaking in Kenneth's presence, and Kenneth recognized it for what it was. The sound of a man taking something seriously. That same afternoon, a Tuesday, Stephanie found him on 12. She came looking for him, which she did occasionally, when she had building-related needs she thought were beneath her office manager's attention or above the standard tenant communication process. She knew where he was likely to be at specific hours of the day. 11 years had given her that knowledge without her ever having had to think about acquiring it. She was in the charcoal blazer. The one she wore when she had a meeting that required confidence rather than warmth. I have a favor to ask, she said. The voice she used for requests she'd already decided he would grant. Reasonable. Pre-resolved. Kenneth waited. Ronald has an investor meeting coming up. He needs to speak specifically about the ownership structure of this building. Not internal details, just the general framework. Who controls the section? What entity holds the management layer? She held his gaze. Steady. I told him you'd been here long enough that you'd know who to ask. Whether there was someone in building management you could connect him with. The HVAC sensor array in the east section required 37 individual connection checks. Kenneth had completed 24. I'll see what I can find out, he said, the professional nod. One clean beat of acknowledgement, transaction registered, moving on. She turned back toward her office. She had taken 5 steps. She stopped. She turned back, and the professional posture was still there, but something else had come into her expression. Something quieter and less curated, the expression from earlier in the marriage, from before the distance between them had accumulated enough to start feeling like a feature rather than a problem. How are you doing? She said. Actual question. Not courtesy. He looked at her. I'm fine, Stephanie. She held his gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. Something moved in her face. Several things at once, probably, none of them organized enough to name out loud. Then she turned back and completed the walk to her office without stopping again. Kenneth went back to the sensor array Connex 25. He thought about the specific request she had just made. Ronald Pierce, who had been calling him someone who doesn't notice things, had sent his wife to ask that same man for the information he needed to continue doing it. The specific geometry of that was something Kenneth allowed himself to fully register, not with anger, because anger would have required more energy than the situation warranted, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a man who now had every piece of what he needed laid out in front of him in proper sequence. He finished the array. He did the rest of the rounds. He drove to Hyde Park. He did not stay for dinner. He sat on the porch with Donna for 40 minutes, while she finished the peas and Shafran provided periodic commentary from next door about the state of the November forecast and what it meant for her window boxes, and then he drove back north and sat in the sub-level office and looked at the folder with Ronald Pierce written on the tab and thought about Thursday, not with anticipation, with the settled attention of a man who has prepared something carefully and is now waiting for the moment to use it. Friday, 3:17 in the afternoon, Pamela's assistant sent the file transfer notification to his work email, and Kenneth downloaded it in the sub-level office with the door locked and the monitor bank running its slow rotation of all 40 floors. 6 audio files. He started with the first one and listened through in order, because sequence mattered and he did not skip steps. The first 5 calls were unremarkable in the way that rehearsed performances are unremarkable. Investor language applied with care. Projections hedged correctly. Strategy described in the cautious, layered vocabulary of a man who had learned through painful experience that every word on a recorded call was a potential exhibit. Ronald Pierce on those calls was professional, which is to say controlled, which is to say the version of himself he had constructed for the benefit of people whose money he needed. The 6th call was dated 6 weeks ago. For 49 minutes it tracked the same way as the others. At minute 49 there was a gap in the ambient sound. A shift. A background adjustment that the compliance recording system registered as a change in room dynamics but not as a termination of the call, because the call had not in fact terminated. Because the system's automatic cutoff requires an explicit disconnect from both parties, and Ronald Pierce had only disconnected his own line without verifying that the recording had stopped. Standard compliance systems do not stop recording because one participant believes the conversation is over. They stop when the session is formally closed. Ronald Pierce's voice came through clearly, relaxed in a way that the previous 49 minutes had not permitted. Speaking to someone else in the room with the ease of a man who believed he was off the record. Bro, I'm 1 step from closing this. 1 step. A second voice, amused. What step? The building manager's wife is helping me get inside the ownership structure of a 220 South Wacker. She thinks it's a business research request. When I have it confirmed, I pitch the Atlanta group as having verified insider access. They hear that and they commit without another question. He paused. The husband is not a factor. He shows up, he does his job. He doesn't ask questions about anything above his pay grade. He doesn't notice what's happening around him. The second voice. You sure about that? I've been in this building 14 months. The man vacuums the carpet and checks the thermostats. He's not looking at anything else. Ronald's voice carried a satisfaction in it, the voice of someone who has surveyed the terrain and found it unoccupied. I almost feels bad for the guy, almost. Kenneth stopped the recording. He sat in the office without moving for a while. He was not angry. This was not composure performing as not anger. He genuinely was not angry. In the same way that a man reading a diagnostic report about a building problem he has already identified and already begun correcting does not become angry at the report for confirming what he already knew. The information had value. The information was being used. The anger would have been beside the point. He pressed play again. He listened to the whole thing a second time. Then he called Pamela. I've heard it, he said. I expected your call. Her voice was level but carried something underneath it. Something that was not quite anger on his behalf, but was adjacent to it in the way that 11 years of professional relationship occasionally produced adjacency to the personal. Kenneth, he has been using the address of your property to represent to investors that he has access as he doesn't have. That is a potentially actionable misrepresentation under securities regulations. Separate from anything involving Stephanie, I know. You have options beyond Thursday's meeting, I know that too. He looked at the monitor bank. Floor 15, empty at this hour. Has Capital Horizon been contacted? Wednesday. I spoke with their general counsel. I framed it as an investor-to-investor disclosure, which is exactly what it is. I told them I had documentation indicating the fund had been marketed to potential investors using representations about a property relationship that the fund's manager does not in fact possess, and that as a fellow limited partner we felt an obligation to ensure they had accurate information before making further commitment decisions. A pause. They thanked me, formally. That's all they said on the call. What did the thank you sound like? Like a firm that was already making a phone call internally before our conversation was finished. Kenneth nodded. Thursday stands, she confirmed, and Kenneth. There's one more thing. Brenda Wright from the Tribune called this office Tuesday. She's an investigative reporter. She's been working a story on Ronald Pierce for 4 months independently through a source connected to the Naperville settlement. She's nearly done verifying. She called looking for corroboration on the building relationship. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? Nothing yet. I told her I'd look into what I could confirm and call her back. Pamela's voice was careful now. Precise. If her piece runs before Thursday, Pierce will be in defensive posture before he walks into that room. The conversation becomes harder to control. Can you hold her until after Thursday? I can offer her a Thursday confirmation after the meeting. Tell her I have information that will complete her picture, and that giving her access before I've completed my own process would compromise both parties. Journalists who are working a serious story understand source management. She'll wait if the trade is worth it. Is the trade worth it? What I can give her after Thursday will make the piece significantly stronger than what she has now. Yes, it's worth it, do it, Kenneth said. And Pamela, have her there Thursday. Not in the room, available how? In the building after the meeting. If Pierce decides to respond publicly, I want Brenda Wright to be the first journalist he encounters. The pause extended. Then, that's elegant, it's accurate, Kenneth said. That's different. He ended the call. He looked at the folder on his desk one more time. He opened the locked drawer. He placed the folder inside, alongside the bank statements and the ownership documentation, and the letter he had drafted 3 weeks ago on Coleman Properties letterhead, the one with the Webb family trust seal at the bottom. He locked the drawer. He went to do the evening check on the 49th floor store, which he had been meaning to get to all week, and which he completed methodically and without distraction because the building required what it required, regardless of what else was happening inside it. Thursday. 1:45 in the afternoon, Kenneth arrived at the corner conference room on the 15th floor 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. He had chosen this room over the building management office on 3, over the neutral conference space on 7, over every other option available to him in a 40-floor building, for the specific reason that this hallway camera had archived 4 months of footage he had reviewed on 3 occasions. Footage of 2 people choosing to stand at a proximity that had nothing to do with professional necessity. He had not used that footage. He had not needed to use it. But he had chosen this room because his grandfather had told him that the room where you have a conversation shapes what the conversation can contain, and he wanted this particular conversation to happen in the room where the relevant facts had first made themselves visible. He sat at the head of the table, the chairman's position. Not because he needed the symbolism for himself, but because the room communicated things that words could take longer to deliver, and he had 15 minutes and he did not want to spend any of them on setup. The window behind him showed the Chicago River 15 floors below, gray and deliberate. In the afternoon light, the pedestrian bridge crossing it at the midpoint, a water taxi on its regular route cutting a clean line through the surface. He placed the folder in front of him. He waited. He heard the elevator at 1:58. Ronald Pierce walked in at 2 o'clock with the charcoal suit and the AP Royal Oak and the particular species of confidence that had been constructed and reconstructed after each failure, patched each time with more surface, more performance, until the performance was the only structural element remaining. He was objectively a good-looking man, tall, well-maintained. The smile arrived early, before he'd fully registered Kenneth at the head of the table, the reflexive smile of someone who had trained themselves to lead with it in all professional contexts. He saw Kenneth, the smile recalibrated, not disappeared, adjusted. The specific adjustment of a man deciding how to categorize an unexpected element. Kenneth, easy, familiar. Like colleagues at a function. I wasn't expecting you. I thought this was a property management meeting. It is, Kenneth said. Sit down. Something in the instruction, its flatness, its lack of social cushioning, moved across Ronald's face. He sat. Not in the chair directly across from Kenneth, but the one at the middle of the table's side. The position that said, I am not subordinate to whoever is at the head. An instinct, probably not conscious. I'll be straight with you. Ronald began, the practiced opening of a man who led with transparency as a rhetorical strategy. If there are least concerns, I'm happy to address them, but I'd normally handle that through my office manager. So I'm not entirely sure what we're. Kenneth placed the document on the table and slid it across, one page facing up. The ownership certificate, Webb Family Trust, 220 South Wacker Drive, Kenneth James Webb Trustee, the notary seal at the bottom, the trust registration number that had been on file with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds since 1988. Ronald looked down. He read it. His eyes moved from the top of the document to the bottom and then back to the trust seal, and then to the name, and then he looked up at Kenneth, and for the first time the smile was simply gone. Not reconstructed, not adjusted, gone. And what was underneath it was not rage or shame, but something more fundamental than either of those things. The specific expression of a man whose workings assumption about the terrain he has been moving through has just been revised completely, and without warning. This is the building's ownership document, Ronald said. Careful, testing the fact against the reality it is. And your name, Kenneth James Webb, trustee of the Webb Family Trust, which has held this property since 1988. My grandfather purchased it. My father administered it. I've been the trustee since my father died 15 years ago. Kenneth kept his voice at the same register. Nothing elevated, nothing performed. Just the documented fact, stated by the person it concerned. I'm the man you've been describing as someone who doesn't notice what's happening around him. The conference room held its silence. The water taxi had completed its route. The river moved. Ronald's hand on the polished table surface was not entirely still. Look, the suit shifted. A repositioning. The move of a man who is buying himself seconds. I understand how certain things can look out of context. There may have been conversations in informal settings that. Kenneth placed the small recording device on the table. He pressed play. The compliance archive reproduced Ronald Pierce's voice with excellent fidelity. The ambient room sound. The relaxed register of a man who believed he was off the record. Bro, I'm one step from closing this. The building manager's wife is working it from inside. He doesn't notice what's happening around him. I almost feel bad for the guy. Almost. Kenneth stopped the recording. The silence after it was a different quality than the silence before it. Heavier, with an orientation to it. The silence of a room in which a person has heard their own words played back them in a context that transforms those words from private to permanent. Ronald's hand on the table had stopped pretending to be still. That's from a compliance recorded investor update call, Kenneth said. Your disclosure language, which you agreed to at the beginning of each session, states that all calls are recorded for regulatory compliance purposes. You have signed acknowledgement of that on file. My trust is a limited partner in your fund. We receive all achievement materials, including the archive. He did not rush any of it. I'm not presenting this as a legal proceeding. I'm presenting it so you understand what you have been doing. In my building, with my property's address. With my wife, the word wife landed the way it was meant to land. Not as a weapon, as a fact. The last fact in a sequence of facts. Ronald Pierce looked at the ownership document still lying between them. He looked at it for a long time then. I have active investor commitments. His voice had changed. The architecture of confidence was structurally intact, the learned posture, the measured delivery, but whatever had been filling it had drained. If this information reaches the wrong people before I've had a chance to manage it, those commitments collapse, and I lose everything I've been building for 3 years. Capital Horizon Group withdrew their position this morning, Kenneth said. You'll have formal notification in your inbox when you return to your office. The seam opened. It wasn't a collapse. Nothing in the room shook. Ronald Pierce sat very still in his expensive suit in a room that belonged to someone else and heard the specific sound of the structure he had been building coming apart without anyone having to raise a voice. Capital Horizon, he said. Quiet, not a question. Just the name, placed with the sankam someone who has just understood the full shape of what they're holding. They're sophisticated institutional investors. When they received accurate information about how their fund was being positioned in the marketplace, they made their own decision. I didn't. Instruct them. Kenneth's voice carried no satisfaction. I ensured they had complete information. That's all. You've been planning this, flat, factual. Not accusing, I've been paying attention, Kenneth said. Those aren't the same thing. The door opened. Pamela came in first, navy vest, gold frames. The unhurried entrance of someone who is prepared for this moment and does not need to announce the preparation. Behind her was a woman Ronald had not met before. Natural hair close to her head, a worn leather notepad under one arm, the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where people were uncomfortable and had stopped finding that quality unusual. "Mr. Pierce," Pamela said. "I'm Pamela Scott, legal counsel for the Webb Family Trust. This is Brenda Wright, investigative reporter with the Chicago Tribune. She's been independently verifying information about Pierce Investment Group for a story she's preparing and has agreed, as a professional courtesy, to give you an opportunity to respond before publication." Brenda Wright looked at Ronald Pierce with the neutral attention of someone taking inventory of a scene she had already partially mapped. "I have specific questions about the representations Pierce Investment Group made regarding its relationship with 220 South Wacker Drive. Yes, I want to ensure the published account is accurate. If you'd prefer to have legal counsel present before we speak, I can give you time to make that call. Ronald Pierce looked at the three people in the room, at the ownership document, at the recording device, at the river outside the window, which had no opinion about any of this, and continued to move. "I need to call my attorney," he said. "Of course," Kenneth said. He stood. He picked up the folder and the recording device and placed them in his jacket's interior pocket with the same unhurried care he brought to every task. He did not look back at the table. He did not need to see Ronald Pierce's face to know what was in it. He had seen enough faces in enough rooms when the weight of a person's choices finally arrived all at once, and there was nothing instructive in watching it happen. The work was done. The room was real. The rest would proceed according to the logic of the situation, which had its own momentum now. He walked down the 15th floor corridor, past the supply closet, past the east camera, past the window looking north toward the river. He pressed the elevator button, and the elevator arrived promptly. Because the elevator maintenance on this bank had been properly handled and the system was running correctly. He rode down to the sublevel. Brian was sitting on the edge of the equipment table, sandwich in hand, which he set down when Kenneth came through the door. "Done?" Brian said. "Done." Brian nodded slowly. He picked the sandwich back up, looked at it, set it back down without eating. "He wasn't what I expected. What did you expect?" "More, I think. Someone with more." He searched for the word. "Substance. The people who cause the most damage rarely have more substance up close," Kenneth said. "They have more performance. Those aren't the same thing either." Brian thought about this with the concentrated expression he used when something was reorganizing itself in his understanding. Then, "Is that supposed to make me feel better about it?" "It's just true," Kenneth said. "Whether it helps is your business." He sat down at the desk and opened the monitor bank and watched 40 floors continue their afternoon. People moving through corridors and lobbies and elevators, doing their work, making their calls, living inside a building they rented from a trust that was administered by the man watching the monitors in the sub-level in a Navy maintenance uniform, and none of them knowing it, and none of them needing to. His phone showed a message from Pamela, sent 3 minutes after he'd left the room. Capital Horizon confirmation arrived Pierce's office at 2:47. 2 of his secondary investors have already made inquiry calls to his associate. The story is in motion without additional input from us. He put the phone down. He picked up the inspection clipboard. The 14th floor had finally been checked. He moved to the next item on the list. The Sunday Tribune ran Brenda Wright's piece at 6:15 in the morning, digital first, print to follow, the way serious investigative work ran now, quickly and with documentation attached. Kenneth read it at the kitchen table with his first cup of coffee. His name did not appear. Coleman Properties was mentioned once as the property management entity for 220 South Wacker Drive. With no further context, the piece was about investment group. About the pattern that Brenda had assembled over 4 months of careful work. The 2 failed funds, the Naperville settlement, the marketing representations that could not be substantiated, the investor communications that described access and relationships that an examination of public records could not support. Brenda had written it without adjectives that did the work the facts should do. She had not called Ronald Pierce a fraud. She had laid out what he had said, what he had documented, what investors had been told, and what an examination of available records showed to be true. The distance between those things was the story. She trusted the distance. By 9 o'clock, 3 of Ronald's remaining active investors had requested documentation reviews from his compliance office. By 10:30, one had retained outside counsel. By the end of the following week, Pierce Investment Group LLC had filed for dissolution with the Secretary of State. It happened the way these things happened in Chicago's business community when the money left, without announcement, without press statement, just a filing, and then a name that stopped appearing in the relevant contexts. The Naperville suit resurfaced. The settlement agreement was being challenged on procedural grounds by the opposing counsel, who had been waiting for a change in circumstances that made the challenge viable and had now found one. 2 additional investor complaints were filed with the State Securities Board, which would move at the pace of institutions, which was to say slowly, but which would move. Kenneth learned about the dissolution from the building's property coordinator, who sent a standard tenant notification that the lease on office space 15 North would not be renewed, and the tenant had indicated they would vacate by the 1st of December. He logged the notification, scheduled a full inspection of the unit for December 3rd, and noted on the inspection calendar that the northeast corner window seals needed attention before the unit was relisted. Brian heard about the dissolution from Angela, which was inevitable, and brought the information to Kenneth in the sublevel with the expression of a man who had been involved in something larger than his job description and was still processing the dimensions of it. Floor 15, Brian said. Going dark, I know. I received the vacancy notice. Right, Brian stood there for a moment. Of course you did. Kenneth did not look up from the clipboard. Does schedule the December 3rd inspection. Full unit. HVAC, electrical window seals on the northeast. I want it ready to relist by January. Brian wrote it down. Then he looked at what he'd written. Then at Kenneth. You're already thinking about the next tenant. The building doesn't stop running because one tenant leaves. I know that. Brian capped his pen. I'm just saying. Some people would take a minute. I took the minutes I needed, Kenneth said. The next step is the next step. Brian was quiet for a moment. And then, in the tone of a man delivering a message he'd been given, Angela wants to know if you're all right. Tell her I'm fine. She says everyone says that. Tell her she's right. He moved to the next item on the clipboard. And tell her thank you. I mean it. Brian relayed the thank you to Angela that afternoon, and Angela received it with the satisfaction of someone whose care had been acknowledged without being deflected, and the building continued its operations, the way the building always continued, because the building was not waiting for anything. 3 days after the dissolution filing, Brenda Wright called, not for new information. The story was published, the follow-up reporting was already in motion, and she was, by her own description, 3 weeks into the next investigation. She called to tell him that 2 of Ronald's former investors had reached out to her independently after the piece ran, not with new information but with questions about whether they had standing to pursue claims. She was directing them to attorneys. She was not their advocate, but she had given them names. I wanted you to know, she said, because some of those people were hurt in ways that were real and specific. And part of why they have a path forward is because someone made sure they had accurate information before the story ran. A pause. I also want to tell you that you didn't have to stay out of the piece. The story would have been more dramatic with your name and the trust and the full account of the building. A lot of people in your position would have wanted that. It wasn't my story, Kenneth said. The investors are the ones who were harmed. The piece should center on that. Most people with the deed don't see it that way. Kenneth thought about his grandfather, who had never given an interview, his father, who had turned down speaking invitations from venues that would have given him a larger platform because he said the work lived in the room where people knew you, not in rooms where they only knew your reputation. Most people with the deed, he said, would have worn different clothes to work. Brenda Wright laughed. The real kind, unguarded. And then she said she hoped he had the kind of days ahead that matched what quite done, and she ended the call. He sat in the sublevel after that, monitor bank running, 40 floors going about the ordinary business of a Chicago afternoon, and he thought about what she'd said, about centering, about the specific discipline of a man who has something to say and chooses the right moment over the fast one, who has something to prove and chooses not to prove it, who owns something considerable and chooses to understand ownership as stewardship rather than statement. His grandfather had not needed the room to know his name. His father had not needed the platform to do the work. Kenneth had spent his entire adult life learning what those two facts meant in practice. And he had finished learning, and he suspected he would not finish learning, and he had made his peace with that because the learning was the work, and the work was the point. He turned off the monitor bank at 6:15. He drove south to Hyde Park. He sat on the porch with Donna in the November cold, and Sharon brought sweet potato pie from next door without being asked, and the three often. And the Fram sat in the particular warmth of people who have been through something together and do not need to name it to feel its completion, and the swing creaked on its chains in the evening wind, and the neighborhood went about its evening. And Kenneth Webb was exactly where he needed to be, which was here, which had always been enough, which he was only now, at 46, beginning to fully understand. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays arrived in Chicago, without negotiation. Cold that had made up its mind. Low clouds sitting on the lake like something that had been there long enough to feel permanent. The oak on the east side of the brownstone had surrendered most of its leaves to the week's wind, and what remained were the last ones, the stubborn ones that needed one more hard push before they'd finally let go of the branch. Kenneth had been awake since 5:30, not from anxiety. From the particular quality of attention that arrives before significant days, the body's understanding that something is going to happen and that the right preparation for it is stillness rather than motion. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, the bed Stephanie had planted in their 3rd year in the house and maintained with the same focused energy she brought to everything she decided mattered. The raised planters along the south fence that were bare now, waiting for spring with the patience of things that knew the season would change regardless. Bob felt what anyone felt, folded. In the locked drawer. He had checked it last night, not because anything in it was going to change, but because his grandfather had walked the improvisator on Sunday evenings as a matter of practice. Not from worry, but from the understanding that ownership required regular, first-hand contact with the thing owned, and Kenneth had inherited this practice and applied it to everything that mattered to him, including documents. At 9:56, Stephanie's car appeared in the driveway. She sat in it for 3 minutes before she opened the door. He watched this from the kitchen window without any particular interpretation. She was doing what she needed to do before she came in. That was her business. He turned away from the window and poured a second cup of coffee he didn't drink and stood at the counter he'd built 5 years ago, during a long weekend, when the weather had trapped them inside, and Stephanie had complained about the bracket alignment for 2 months before admitting it was exactly right. He heard the key in the lock, the door, her bag on the hook in the front hall, then her coat, which meant she intended to stay for the conversation rather than keep one foot already pointed toward the exit. She came into the kitchen doorway and stopped there. She looked different in a way that had nothing to do with the dark sweater or the flat boots or her hair in its natural state, unpressed and full around her face. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't for a while. Not the professional self, not the public one. The one underneath both of those, the one that had existed before she'd learned to perform in rooms, the one from early in the marriage when she used to laugh at things without thinking about how the laugh have landed. She looked at the folder on the table. She looked at him. "Sit down," he said, and she sat. He had organized the documents in sequence because sequence was how understanding accumulated. You didn't hand someone the conclusion before the foundation. You built the foundation first, and then the structure, and then the conclusion had the weight it needed to carry. He placed the first document in front of her without speaking, the deed. 220 South Wacker Drive, Webb Family Trust. Kenneth James Webb, trustee. 4 pages, notarized, the trust seal at the bottom of the last one, the Cook County registration number that had been on file since 1988. Stephanie picked it up. She read the first page. She read it again. Her hands were steady on the paper. She was reading it the way she read contracts. with the careful focus of a professional who understood that documents contained facts and that facts required proper processing before response. She read to the bottom. She read it a second time. She set it on the table and looked at it lying there between them. You own this building, Lo. Not much air behind the words. The voice of someone recalculating from a foundation that has just shifted. I have since my father died, Kenneth said, and my grandfather before that. He bought it in 1988. My father added to the portfolio in 1999 and again in 2004. When my father passed, I became the trustee. He kept his voice at the same register it had been in all morning. Present, even. I've owned it longer than we've been together. She looked at the document. The building where I have my office, she said. Yes, where Ronald had his office. Yes, she was assembling it. He could see the process happening. The building inspector last spring who had addressed Kenneth as Mr. Webb with a deference she'd noticed and attributed to a tip. The contractors who had deferred to his assessment in conversations she'd half heard and not questioned. The way he had always known about building decisions before the official tenant communications went out. The way certain people in the building looked at him when something genuinely went wrong. Not at the management office, not at the property coordinator, at Kenneth, as though they understood on some unspoken level where the actual authority lived. She had walked past the evidence for 11 years. Not because she was unintelligent, because she had placed him in a category early, and the category had walls she had never thought to examine. He placed the second set of documents in front of her. The 2 additional commercial properties, the trust's full portfolio, registered and documented, the complete picture of what Calvin Sr. had started, and what George had grown, and what Kenneth now administered, then the rent roll. She saw her firm's name on it, the monthly figure, the 12-year history of payments routing from Stephanie Webb Piazza's accounts through Coleman Properties management layer. I've been paying you rent, she said, flat. Not accusatory, just the arithmetic of it, finally resolved. From the day you signed the lease on 12, he said. The payment routes through the management subsidiary, standard lease administration. The entity name on your agreement is Coleman Properties, which is a subsidiary of the Webb Family Trust. A pause. You never looked at who owned Coleman Properties. She said nothing for a moment. Why would I? Genuine question. The kind that contains its own devastating answer the moment it's released into the air between 2 people. Kenneth said nothing. She understood. Why didn't you tell me? She said. The professional composure was still structurally present, but something inside it was giving way now, the way a frame holds its shape past the point where the material can bear it. He had thought about this answer, not to manufacture it. To find it accurately, in the beginning I was waiting to see who you were when you didn't know, he said. And then years went by and I kept waiting for you to ask, not about the building specifically, about me, about what I was actually doing there. What any of it meant, he looked at her. The question never came, something moved across her face, complicated and multiple, and none of it managed. I thought I knew, she said. I thought I understood the shape of our life. You understood the shape you decided to see. Those aren't the same thing. She looked down at the table. He let the silence do what silence did when it had earned itself. Then he reached into the folder and placed the bank statements in front of her. 3 years old, the ink at the edges slightly faded. 14 months of transfers, each one annotated in his handwriting, with the corresponding medical invoice number and the provider name and the date of service. Her mother's name on every invoice, the specialist in Evanston, who her mother had trusted since the first procedure. The 2 admissions at Rush that her mother had Stephanie were almost entirely covered by insurance, because her mother was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life not wanting her daughter to carry the weight of numbers. Stephanie looked at the first page. She found the total at the bottom, $31,240. My mother's medical bills, she said, barely above her breath. The insurance covered 60%, Kenneth said. I covered the remainder, over 14 months. Quietly, through the trust's ancillary accounts, he kept his voice even. Not performing restraint, actually calm, with the calm of a man who has already made peace with the decision and is now simply reporting it. I didn't tell you because I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because she was sick and you needed her to have the care she trusted, and I was in a position to make that the possible of it. Stephanie pressed her fingers against her mouth, and then she was on the floor, not a dramatic fall, not a movie collapse, not the kind of thing that announced itself, just a slow, involuntary lowering, her knees finding the kitchen floor, her hands gripping the table's edge, the body doing what bodies did when the last piece of structure gave way, and everything that had been held came out at once, without shape or management. I'm sorry, over and over, the words coming faster than she could organize them. Kenneth, I am so sorry. Please, please just give me a chance to. You made your choice. Not raised, not hard. Final in the way that certain true things are final, not because they were said loudly, but because they were simply accurate. You looked at 11 years of a man showing up for you and called it something you needed to upgrade from. You assigned it a word, and then she chose the word. She was still on the floor. He did not reach down to help her up, not as punishment, because some reckonings had to complete themselves at the pace they set. Intervening before the work was done only meant the work came back unfinished at a later time. You told me he had an office in the building where I worked, he said, and I want you to understand something, not as a wound. As a fact, he paused. You were paying me rent to have that conversation at my table. In my building, she still looked up at him. The mascara was gone, not smudged. Gone, the way rain takes everything temporary with it and leaves what was underneath. Her face looked younger than it had in years, or more honest, which sometimes looked like the same thing. He stood. He gathered the documents with the same unhurried care he brought to every task, squaring the edges, returning them to the folder in the order they'd been presented. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed a white envelope on the table beside the folder. There's one more thing, he said. She looked at the envelope. She got up from the floor first, which took a moment, steadying herself with the edge of the table and then finding her own vertical the way she had always found it, by locating her spine and building upward from there. She sat back in the chair. Her hands were not entirely steady when she reached for the envelope, but they were trying. She opened it. She read the letter, the Webb Family Trust seal at the bottom. Coleman Properties letterhead, a full scholarship to the graduate program in strategic communication at DePaul University. No conditions, no timeline restrictions, no requirement to demonstrate anything to anyone before accepting. She read it twice. I don't understand, she said. My father started a fund when I was 17, Kenneth said. He called it Second Chance. He established it for women who had made serious mistakes, who had chosen the wrong thing when it mattered, but who still wanted to build something honest afterward. He looked at her directly. You are not the first person to receive it. You will not be the last. Why? She said. One word, all the performance gone from it. Because you're 39 years old. Because you are intelligent enough to build something real if you choose to. Because what you did wrong is not the whole of what you are. He moved toward the back of the kitchen, toward the door to the porch. This is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a transaction between you and whatever you believe in. This is an opportunity. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference. He stopped at the door. He placed his hand on her shoulder for a moment. Not tender, not cold. The touch of a man who has known someone for 11 years and is saying goodbye to what that knowing was, while acknowledging that the knowing was real and that some part of him hoped she found her way to something truer than where she'd arrived. Then he walked out onto the back porch. November cold. The yard, the bare planters, the oak on the east side with its last leaves. He stood there and listened to her breathing coming back into order through the screen door, in and out, the body reclaiming its rhythm after the storm has moved through. He let himself feel what there was to feel about 11 years. He gave it the time it deserved. Not a performance of grief, just the honest weight of it, the accumulated Tuesdays, the specific texture of a shared life, the kitchen counter and the pendant light and the particular sound of her key in the lock and all the 1,000 ordinary things that were now past tense. He felt them, he gave them their due. Then he walked to his truck and drove north. He called Donna that evening from the brownstone, the first call he'd made to her since Saturday morning when he'd confirmed he was going to the house. She picked up on the first ring. It's done, Sebi, he said, a short silence. Not surprise. She had known this was coming. She had known since October, probably before. How did she receive it? Hard, honestly. She told me the worst part herself, without being asked. What was the worst part? He told her about the attorney. About the phrase broke janitor. About the admission that the money calculation had preceded the moral one. Donna was quiet for a long moment, and you gave the scholarship anyway, she said. I gave her the scholarship anyway. Another pause. Something moving in the silence that was not judgment and not surprise, and was closest to the particular quality of a parent processing information about their child that reflects something of the parent as well. Something about where the child learned to make the choices they made. Your father would have done the same thing, she said. He would have argued with himself about it for 3 times as long. But he would have done it, I know. Does it feel like the right thing? He sat with this, genuinely. The way he sat was the question that mattered, not reaching for the comfortable answer, but waiting for the honest one. It feels true, he said. Right and true don't always overlap. In this case, I think they do. Donna made the sound she made for things she approved of without needing to make a speech about. Low. Brief. Sufficient. Come to dinner Sunday, she said. Sharon has decided she's cooking. She hasn't told me what. She says it's a surprise and I should trust the process. Do you trust the process? Absolutely not. A dry pause. I would like you there as a buffer. I'll be there at 2. 1:30, she said, before she arrives and takes over my kitchen. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while. The counter, the pendant light Stephanie had ordered at midnight on a Tuesday. Laughing, turning the phone around to show him, this one. He had liked it immediately. He still did. He made tea and stood at the counter and drank it and thought about the white envelope on the table and whether he had done the right thing and arrived at the same answers he'd arrived at when he drafted the letter 3 weeks ago, which was that his father had believed the measure of a person was not their worst moments, but they did with the distance between that moment and the next one. And Stephanie at 22 had sat in a borrowed car outside a public library in Bronzeville, studying for an exam she'd paid for herself, with no particular evidence that it would amount to anything, except her own belief that it would. That woman still existed. The scholarship was for her. He washed the cup. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty. Stephanie sent a text the following Saturday morning. Not a call. The text of someone who had things to say but didn't trust her voice to carry them cleanly. Thank you for the letter. I called DePaul on Friday. I have an admissions meeting in January. I don't know if I deserve this, but I'm going to try to deserve it after the fact. He read it twice. He wrote back. Good one word. A door closed quietly. Not slammed, not left open. Closed with the care of someone who understood that some closings were their own kind of respect. He put his phone in his pocket and went to work. 3 months passed. Chicago moved from November into December with the deliberate pace of a city that had done this enough times to stop being surprised by it, and then into January, which was not a month so much as a condition, and then into February, which arrived with a particular determination of a season, almost finished that still had something left to prove. The 14th of February was a clear Saturday, cold that had burned off the previous day's cloud cover and left the sky a specific shade of pale blue that only appeared in Chicago in winter, and the color of something that had decided to be present without apology. The groundbreaking for Webb Commons happened on a vacant lot in Englewood, on the south side. A lot that had been empty for 11 years and had seen 3 development proposals come and dissolve before the Webb Family Trust's housing initiatives partnered with a non-profit housing organization and the Alderman's office and affordable, an architectural firm that specialized in affordable residential construction, and produced a plan that survived the process from proposal to groundbreaking without losing its shape. 47 units, 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom configurations, income qualified. Priority consideration for families already residing in the surrounding blocks. The people who had been there through iteration of the neighborhood's difficulty and deserved first access to what was being built in it. Kenneth stood in the center of the lot in his good coat, the dark wool one that had been his father's and that fit him without alteration, while a gathering of approximately 60 people arranged themselves near the boundary markers. He shook the alderman's hand. He shook the non-profit director's hand. He spoke briefly with the lead architect about the foundation timeline and the expected spring construction start. He accepted a cup of coffee from a folding table near the temporary signage and let it warm his hands. The alderman spoke for 9 minutes. Efficient. For an alderman, the non-profit director spoke for 5. A woman named Gloria, who had lived 4 blocks from this lot for 22 years and whose name was on the early access list for one of the 3-bedroom units, spoke for 3 minutes. And those 3 minutes were the ones that carried the weight of the entire event, because she said in plain language what the project meant to the people it was being built for. And she said it without rhetoric or performance, just the facts of her life and the fact of what this represented for it. Kenneth spoke last, 2 minutes. He said his grandfather had bought a building in the Loop when most of the money was looking somewhere else. He said his father had believed that ownership was a form of stewardship, and that stewardship had a direction. He said this project was where his family's work had been pointing for 60 years, whether all of them had been able to see it clearly at the time or not. He said thank you and stepped back. The crowd was not large, but it was present in a way that larger crowds sometimes were not. People who had come because they were connected to the thing, not because they were obligated to appear. Donna stood at the edge of the gathering in the charcoal coat with the wide lapels that she wore for occasions that warranted her best, not at the front. To the side, slightly back, watching rather than being watched. She had done this at every significant event in Kenneth's life, positioned herself where she could see clearly without requiring the center of the frame. His grandfather had done the same. The Webbs were not a family that needed the camera to find them. Sharon was beside her. Of course, Sharon was beside her. Sharon was in a deep plum wool coat with matching gloves, having apparently decided that the occasion called for full commitment mood to the principle she'd been living since her 50s, and she was explaining to a stranger standing nearby the full history of her relationship with the Webb family. Starting from the year she moved in next door to Donna and working forward to the present moment, with a level of narrative detail that suggested she had been waiting for a suitable audience. Brian was near the temporary construction fence in his maintenance coveralls, because he had arrived 2 hours early to help with equipment setup and had been absorbed into the logistics of the event in a way that made him simultaneously crew and guest. He was photographing everything on his phone with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a man who had decided this was a day worth documenting at high frequency. Janitor from the building's front desk had come on her own, in a burgundy wool coat, standing quietly near the back of the gathering, without having announced to Brian that she was coming, because she knew Brian would attach himself to her presence immediately, and she wanted at least the first portion of the event to be her own experience, undiluted by Brian's commentary. Smart woman. He had always known that. The alderman finished his remarks. The nonprofit director said a few words about the construction timeline. Gloria folded her notes and put them in her coat pocket with the satisfied expression of some who had said what they came to say. And then Kenneth saw Stephanie. She was at the edge of the lot, near the chain-link fence that ran along the sidewalk. Dark coat he hadn't seen before, not one of the tailored ones from before. Something simpler and less armored. Her hair in its natural state. No blazer, no structured shoulders. None of the external architecture she had built over the years to manage the impression she made on rooms. She was looking at the temporary signs, the rendered drawings of the completed building mounted on foam board beside the entrance, and she was reading them with the attention of someone who was actually trying to understand rather than assess. She saw him looking. She didn't leave. He walked over. They stood side by side looking at the foundation markers without speaking for a moment, which was its own kind of communication, the communication of two people who have said the important things and are now in the territory beyond them. I read about the project in the Tribune follow-up piece, she said. Last month, the one about the housing initiative, she paused. I wanted to see it. You found it, he said. I've been making a point of looking at things more carefully lately. Trying to, her voice was measured, not performing steadiness, working toward it, which was different. The DePaul admissions meeting was Tuesday. I got in. Program starts in September. Good, she turned slightly toward him, not fully. The gesture of someone who understood there were limits to the territory and was respecting them. I need to tell you something. Not because it changes anything. Because I've been carrying it and I think you should know the whole version. He waited. When I filed the papers, she said, before I knew anything about the trust or the building or any of it. I told my attorney I wanted everything I was entitled to from. She stopped, breathed, I told her I wanted my fair share from the broke janitor. I said if I couldn't have the life I wanted, at least I could walk away with what the law allowed from someone who wouldn't fight it. She looked at the foundation markers rather than at him. I needed you to know that version. Not just the version where I was deceived by Ronald. The version where I had already made the uglier calculation before I knew the whole picture. The construction crew was 30 feet away, marking survey points with the focused attention of people doing precise work in cold weather. The alderman was near the rendering boards, shaking hands. Gloria was talking to two women Kenneth didn't recognize, using her hands to describe something large. That took something, Kenneth said. Saying it directly, I practiced it 4 times in the car. He was quiet for a moment. Does knowing it change how you see the scholarship, she asked. No, she nodded, slow, accepting I thought it might. What you were prepared to do and what you did are both part of the true account, he said. People aren't one thing. The scholarship is for the part of you that's trying to become something better. What you do with that is yours. She looked at the lot, at the stakes marking where the foundation would be poured, at the 60 people who had come on a cold February Saturday because something was beginning here that was worth showing up for. I thought I was the center of your story, she said quietly, not with self-pity, with the particular quality of understanding that arrived after the fact, accurate and late. I thought this whole year was about me being the wound you'd need years to recover from. The great betrayal, the thing that defined what came before and after. She paused. I'm not the center of it. Am I? You were part of it, Kenneth said. That's not nothing, but it's not the same as the center. She absorbed that. She did not argue with it, or ask him to revise it, or offer a competing account. She stood there dark-eyed in the February old with her hands in her pockets and let it be what it was, which just the truth said plainly and without decoration, which was how truth landed when it had earned the right to land without ceremony. I should go, she said. She said, okay. She started to turn back. The kitchen counter, she said. The one you built. I told the realtor not to change it when we list the house. He looked at her. She nodded once. Walked through the gap in the chain link, up onto the sidewalk, into the February afternoon and then further into the city, and then she was gone. He stood at the boundary of the lot and watched the space where she had been for a moment, not with longing, not with regret, with the specific quiet of a chapter that has ended as cleanly as chapters ended, which was never without cost, but also never without a completeness that arrived only after the last word. Then he turned back, toward the lot, toward the foundation markers and the rendering boards and the 60 people who had come because they believed something was possible here. Toward Brian, who had apparently discovered he'd exhausted his phone's storage capacity and was in active negotiation with Angela about borrowing hers, a negotiation Angela appeared to be conducting on her own terms. Toward Donna, who had seen him turn back and held his gaze across the distance of the lot with the expression she reserved for moments that had completed themselves and didn't require comment. Toward the work, because that was what remained. Donna reached him at the edge of the lot as the gathering began to disperse, the alderman's car pulling away, the non-profit director exchanging final words with the architect, Gloria heading back toward the blocks she had lived in for 22 years. With the walk of someone who has received confirmation of something they had been waiting for. She slipped her arm through his way she had at his father's armor's graveside and at his grandfather's and at every moment in his life that had been large enough to require more than one person present in it. They stood together looking at the lot, at the stakes, at the boundary markers, at the sign that said WBB Commons, the family name but not any single person's name, the way a river carried the name of the watershed rather than any individual rain. Well, Donna said. Yeah, Kenneth said. Sharon appeared at his other side, because Sharon had a gift for placing herself at the center of significant moments with the naturalness of someone who had decided long ago that significance was communal property. I told 8 people about this project, she said. 8 people who didn't know it existed. I may have suggested a level of personal involvement in the planning that was somewhat larger than the actual level. How much larger, considerably? She looked at the lot with the satisfaction of someone who has been vindicated by an outcome. I don't think they'll verify. Kenneth looked at her. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Sharon. I wouldn't have missed it. She patted his arm once with her plum glove, the gesture of a woman who had known him since he was smallest enough to be carried, and was accounting for all the years between then and now in a single touch. Your grandfather would have stood in this exact spot and not said a word, and the silence would have meant everything it needed to mean. She walked back. Kenneth stood where he was. The February sun had been moving through cloud cover all morning, and at this moment it broke through fully, not warm, not close to warm, but present in a way the day hadn't been until now. The kind of light that made you see everything in sharper relief. The lot, the markers, the street beyond the fence, and the neighborhood beyond the street, and the city beyond the neighborhood, and the lake beyond the city. All of it existing in its own relationship with itself. All of it continuing regardless of any individual human drama that happened inside it. He thought about his grandfather in 1988, standing in a loop office signing papers on a building most people thought he'd overpaid for, and not explaining himself to any of them, because F. Calvin Sr. had understood that the work spoke more clearly than the explanation. He thought about his father reading the 23rd Psalm at Calvin Sr.'s graveside at a pace that communicated the psalm had been waiting long enough already and deserved to arrive without rushing. He thought about Brian at this moment, who had successfully borrowed Angela's phone and was now photographing the lot from 3 different angles, while Angela observed this with the expression of someone who had made a tactical error and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He thought about Stephanie at the DePaul admissions office on a Tuesday's day in January, sitting across from someone who didn't know her history, starting again from a foundation she was building herself at, which was how foundations had to be built to hold. He thought about the folder that had started as an empty thing with a name written on the tab and had become the record of something that had needed to be set right and had been. He thought about the locked drawer, now empty of everything it had been holding. And he thought about what his grandfather had been telling him from the beginning, from that porch in Hyde Park when Kenneth was 11 years old, and the old man didn't need to look up because he already knew his grandson was listening. Own something quiet, son. He had understood this for years as an instruction about discretion, about not announcing what you had, about the discipline of letting the work speak instead of the biography. But standing here in the cold February light, on a lot in Englewood where 47 families were going to have somewhere to live, because 3 generations of men had been patient and careful and present in ways that didn't require acknowledgement to be real, he understood for the first time what his grandfather had actually meant. Not quiet as in hidden, quiet as in rooted. The things that were truly yours didn't need noise. They didn't need the room to know their name. They held their ground before anyone arrived to witness them, and they held it after everyone had left, not because they were performing stability, but because stability was what they actually were. A deed was quiet, a foundation was quiet. A man who showed up every morning through the service entrance and knew which elevator ran slow in cold weather and which window seal needed attention and which tenant needed to be spoken to directly rather than through the management layer. A man who did all of this in the same building his grandfather had signed for 60 years ago and whose name nobody in the lobby had connected to the deed. That man was the quietest thing in the building. And the quietest thing was the thing that held everything else up. Brian appeared at his elbow. Angela wants her phone back, Brian said. Also, she wants me to tell you that she's glad she came today. She said to tell you directly because she wasn't sure she'd say it right herself. Tell her I'm glad she came too, Kenneth said. I mean it. I know you mean it. Brian handed over Angela's phone to return to its owner, then stood there for a moment in his coveralls in the February cold on Webb. My grandfather worked maintenance his whole life. Building maintenance, facility work, the same kind of thing you do. He looked at the lot. He used to say the men who actually kept things running were invisible to the people who benefited from the running. He didn't it bitterly. He said it like a fact. Brian paused. I think about that sometimes. When I'm doing the work, your grandfather was right, Kenneth said. I know. Brian put his hands in his pockets. I'm just glad I ended up working for someone who understands why that matters. He walked back toward Angela, who accepted the return of her phone with the expression of someone recording a lesson for future reference. Donna came to stand beside Kenneth one more time. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at the lot, at the markers, At the sign with the family name on it, at the city behind it, at the sky above it. At all of it, with the long view of a woman who had watched this family build something across 6 decades and understood the full shape of what had been built better than anyone who had only seen a portion of it. Your father started the Second Chance Fund because he believed people were more than their worst choices, she said. That if you only responded to people at their worst, you were responding to an incomplete version of them. She paused. He was talking about the women who needed the fund. But he was also talking about everyone else. Kenneth looked at her. He was talking about you too, Donna said, making sure you didn't let the worst of what happened to you become the whole of how you understood it. He thought about this. He thought about the scholarship and why it had not felt like generosity exactly when he had drafted the letter. It had felt like accuracy, like responding to the complete version of Stephanie rather than the reduced one. The 22-year-old in the borrowed car outside the public library was real. The woman who had called him a broke janitor to her attorney was real. Both were part of the complete account. He had responded to the complete account. That was all. He would have handled it the same way, he said. Your father, she said. Yes, he would have. She looked at the lot one more time. He would have argued with himself longer. But he would have arrived at the same place. A pause. The Webbs always arrive at the same place eventually. Patient men win. Sharon's voice from 15 feet away. Donna, I'm cold and I'm hungry and I've been patient long enough. Can we please go get food? Donna looked at Kenneth. Kenneth looked at his mother. And for the first time since October, since before the cocktail party in River North, and the empty folder with the name written and on the tab and the quiet months of paying attention, and the kitchen table and the corner conference room on 15 and all of it, he laughed. Actually laughed. The full version. The one that came from somewhere real. Let's go, he said. 1:30, Donna said. I told you 1:30 and it's almost 2:15. I was doing something. You were always doing something. But she slipped her arm through his again, and they walked toward the gate together. And Sharon fell in on the other side, and the three of them moved through the lot toward the street, while Brian documented their departure at high resolution, and Angela stood nearby, practicing the specific expression of a person who has no involvement in what is happening. He had told Donna once, years ago, that he wasn't sure he understood the difference between what his grandfather meant by quiet and what his grandfather meant by invisible. He had been 33. He had been in the building for years by then, and starting to wonder whether the choice to stay hidden was its own kind of diminishment, had said something. Invisible is something done to you. Quiet is something you choose. There's a difference, and when you're ready, you'll feel it. He had not felt it then, he felt it now. Walking out of the lot in Englewood on a cold Saturday in February, with his mother's arm through his and 60 years of his family's work taking its first physical form in the ground behind him, and the city all around him, the whole vast living weight of it, he felt the difference completely. Invisible was the condition of a man the world had decided not to see. Quiet was the condition of a man who had decided to let the work speak. He had made that decision in a maintenance uniform every room for 15 years, through the service entrance, before the chandeliers were switched on, in the building his grandfather had bought, when the smart money was looking somewhere else. He was still making it. He intended to keep making it, because a foundation didn't announce itself, it simply held. And everything worth building was built on top of something that had been holding long before anyone arrived to notice, and would keep holding long after they were gone, patient and present and quiet in the way that only real things were quiet, certain of their own weight without needing anyone to confirm it. That was the inheritance, not the deed, not the trust, not the 40 floors of glass and steel catching the morning light off Lake Michigan, the understanding. Passed from Calvin Sr. to George to Kenneth, hand to hand across 60 years, through kitchens and porches and gravesides and locked drawers and maintenance uniforms and all the ordinary days that made up the majority of a life and were in the end the whole of its own. Something quiet, son. He did. He always had.